They thought you'd always understand. You didn't chase them down for answers. You didn't threaten to leave every time they pulled away. You didn't force clarity out of someone who clearly didn't know what they wanted. You stayed calm. You stayed regulated. You stayed emotionally steady in a dynamic that was anything but. And that's where the misunderstanding began. Because from the avoidance perspective, your patience didn't register as strength. It registered as tolerance. They didn't see emotional maturity. They saw flexibility. They didn't see discernment. They saw availability. You were able to hold discomfort without erupting. And instead of respecting that capacity, they assumed it meant you had fewer needs, fewer limits, fewer breaking points. You were doing the work of emotional regulation while they were doing the work of emotional distance. And because you weren't escalating, they assumed nothing was wrong. Avoidants are not skilled at reading quiet signals. They respond to urgency, not nuance. They notice explosions, not erosion. So while you were slowly losing trust, they were slowly getting more comfortable. What they didn't realize is that patience is not passivity. Patience is a conscious choice made by someone who is watching, assessing, and keeping score internally. It's the pause before a decision, not the absence of one. You weren't staying because you didn't know your worth. You were staying because you were trying to understand whether they were capable of meeting it. Avoidants often believe that love should feel easy because difficulty feels like danger to them. So when you didn't create chaos, they assumed the connection required no effort. Your calm became the emotional safety net that allowed them to delay showing up. You made it safe for them to stay half present, half invested, half committed, because you were doing the full emotional labor for both of you. And here's the hard truth. Avoidance feels safest when nothing is demanded, when there are no clear expectations, when accountability is soft, when timelines are vague. Your understanding created an environment where they could postpone growth indefinitely, not because you enabled them intentionally, but because you believed that consistency and safety would inspire reciprocity.
It didn't. It inspired comfort.
They didn't feel pressure to rise because they didn't feel the risk of falling. You were steady, predictable, emotionally available, and instead of meeting that standard, they relaxed into it. Your presence became something they relied on, rather than something they reciprocated. And over time, the dynamic quietly shifted from mutual connection to silent imbalance. What fractured the connection wasn't conflict. It was awareness. The moment you stopped explaining yourself, not dramatically, not angrily, but quietly, something changed. The emotional scaffolding you had been providing started to disappear. You asked fewer questions. You offered fewer reassurances. You stopped translating their silence into excuses that made it easier to stay. And suddenly, the relationship felt different to them. Avoidants don't notice when you're hurting. They notice when you're gone. They didn't recognize your power while you were exercising restraint. They recognized it when you withdrew access, because power to an avoidant isn't emotional intelligence, it's consequence. It's the moment when the safety they assumed was permanent is no longer guaranteed. They thought your patience meant you would always understand their fear. They didn't realize it also meant you were paying attention. You were watching how often you had to initiate connection, how often you had to wait, how often you had to shrink your needs to keep the peace. And slowly, quietly, something inside you recalibrated. Your patience had an expiration date, not because you became bitter, but because you became clear. You realized that understanding someone's wounds does not require you to bleed for them. You realize that empathy without reciprocity turns into self-abandonment. And you realize that staying regulated while being emotionally deprived is not strength, it's endurance. That the avoidant didn't see that shift happening. To them, everything seemed fine until it suddenly wasn't. That's because they don't track emotional distance the way secure or self-aware people do. They track disruption, and your growth was silent. They saw permission where there was actually observation. They saw flexibility where there was actually evaluation. They saw patience where there was actually a boundary forming. And when that boundary finally solidified, when you stopped making their avoidance comfortable, the dynamic cracked. Not because you demanded more, but because you stopped giving more than was returned. That's when they felt the loss of control. Not control over you, but control over the environment where they never had to fully show up. They didn't lose you because you changed. They lost you because they misread your stillness. They thought you'd always understand. They didn't realize understanding was never the same as staying forever. Stability didn't scare them, it sedated them. You showed up the same way every time, calm, present, emotionally available without being overwhelming. You were predictable in the way healthy people are predictable. Not boring, not rigid, but reliable. Your words matched your actions. Your care didn't fluctuate based on mood or fear, and instead of inspiring them to rise into that level of integrity, it gave them somewhere soft to land. Consistency is supposed to build trust. With someone capable of intimacy, it does. But with an avoidant, consistency often removes urgency. They didn't experience your steadiness as something to protect. They experienced it as something that would always be there. And when something feels guaranteed, it stops being chosen intentionally. They didn't have to wonder where they stood with you. They didn't have to work to repair distance. They didn't have to stretch emotionally to keep the connection alive. Your consistency became the emotional cushion that allowed them to delay growth. Every time they pulled back and you stayed regulated, it reinforced the belief that nothing would be lost. Every time they went quiet and you remained grounded, it confirmed that discomfort could be avoided without consequence. You weren't building commitment. You were unknowingly building comfort. Avoidants don't leave because something is wrong. They leave when something is real. Real connection demands presence. It demands choice. It demands the willingness to stay emotionally engaged even when closeness triggers fear. Your consistency didn't scare them away. It brought the truth too close. Because in your steadiness, there was no chaos to hide behind, no drama to blame, no instability to point at and say, this is why I can't commit. Your calm made their avoidance visible. And instead of confronting that gap, they relaxed into the dynamic. They let you carry the emotional continuity of the relationship while they floated in and out of it. You became the anchor, and anchors don't get chased. They get relied on. Over time, that reliance replaced intention. They didn't choose you daily. They assumed you. That's the quiet danger of consistency with someone emotionally unavailable. It stabilizes the relationship without stabilizing the person. It creates a functional connection that never requires internal change. And eventually, that imbalance reaches a point where something has to give. Your steadiness made the truth unavoidable. You were ready, and they were not. You were building something forward-facing while they were maintaining something emotionally static. And when the relationship started to ask more of them simply by existing, more presence, more decision, more depth, their nervous system read it as pressure. So they didn't lean in, they leaned away. Not because you were too much, but because your consistency removed their excuses. It exposed the fact that the only thing standing between them and commitment was themselves. They never felt the risk of losing you until they did. You made it safe to stay undecided, safe to hesitate, safe to keep one foot out the door while enjoying the benefits of closeness. You didn't force timelines. You didn't demand labels before they were ready. You believed that emotional safety would naturally lead to emotional investment. But safety without boundaries doesn't create commitment. It creates delay. When someone never has to fear loss, they never learn the value of presence and avoidance. More than anyone, respond not to reassurance, but to reality. They don't move toward closeness because it feels good. They move when avoidance stops working, when the emotional math changes, when the environment no longer allows them to stay half in. Your emotional safety was generous. You held space for their fear. You understood their past. You didn't personalize their distance even when it hurt. And because you didn't weaponize your pain, they never felt the cost of their absence. You absorbed the discomfort quietly, hoping that patience would eventually be met with readiness. What actually happened was the opposite. They learned that they could retreat without losing connection, that they could delay without consequence, that they could remain undecided while you remained emotionally available. Your safety became the reason urgency never developed. Why choose fully today when tomorrow looked exactly the same? Avoidants don't respond to reassurance. They respond to consequence, not punishment, not manipulation, reality. And the reality was this: as long as you kept making absence comfortable, there was no reason for them to change. No reason to confront their fear. no reason to decide. The relationship functioned without requiring them to show up differently. And that made stagnation feel sustainable until it wasn't. The power was never in demanding more, it was in no longer compensating for less. The shift didn't happen when you asked for clarity, it happened when you stopped cushioning the impact of their distance. When you stopped smoothing over the gap, when you stopped being the emotional buffer that protected them from feeling what they were risking. That's when urgency appeared. Not because you threatened to leave, but because you stopped guaranteeing you'd stay. Not because you changed who you were, but because you stopped over functioning in a dynamic that depended on your emotional labor to survive. The safety you provided had allowed them to postpone reality. Your withdrawal brought it back. For the first time, they had to feel the weight of their indecision. The silence didn't feel neutral anymore. The distance didn't feel harmless. What once felt safe now felt uncertain. And uncertainty is the one thing avoidants are forced to respond to. They didn't feel the risk of losing you while you were emotionally cushioning the relationship. They felt it when you stopped. And that's the part that's hardest to accept. It wasn't your love that made them realize your value. It was the absence of your emotional labor. The moment you stopped making things easy to avoid, the cost of avoidance finally registered. Your power was never in how much you gave. It was in what changed when you stopped. You didn't remove safety to punish them. You removed it because you chose yourself. And in doing so, you revealed the truth of the dynamic. They weren't staying because they were committed. They were staying because it was comfortable. Comfort delays growth. Reality demands it. And once reality arrived, everything they had been avoiding stood right in front of them, including the fact that you were never powerless in this connection. You were simply too steady for them to recognize what they stood to lose. They believed you had endless understanding. You listened past what was said. You paid attention to what was avoided, softened, or left unfinished. You could sit in silence without panicking, read between lines without accusing, and hold emotional complexity without needing it to be immediately resolved. Where others would have demanded clarity or walked away sooner, you stayed present and curious. You didn't collapse under uncertainty. You regulated through it. And that's exactly what misled them. Because from the avoidance perspective, your depth didn't register as strength. It registered as capacity. They believed you had endless understanding, endless patience, endless room for ambiguity. Your emotional intelligence became something they assumed was permanent rather than something that required care. They didn't see boundaries forming beneath your calm. They saw a bottomless well. You translated silence into meaning so they didn't have to speak. You made sense of distance so they didn't have to explain it. You held space for fear so they didn't have to confront it. And every time you did that, you unknowingly removed pressure from their nervous system. Avoidants are not unaware. They are relieved. Relieved when someone else does the emotional work. They are avoiding. Avoidants don't test boundaries aggressively. They don't push loudly or demand more. They test quietly, through delay, through postponement, through not yet. I don't know. I need time. And because you could stay regulated inside that waiting room, they assumed you would remain there indefinitely. Your depth wasn't invisible. They just assumed it wouldn't leave. They didn't ask themselves how much it cost you to stay emotionally present while receiving emotional absence. They didn't wonder how long someone could keep translating silence before it became exhaustion. They simply adjusted to the environment you created, one where they could remain emotionally distant without losing connection. That's the quiet tragedy of emotional depth in the wrong dynamic. It becomes a resource rather than a relationship, something drawn from, not something reciprocated. And because you didn't demand immediate change, they assumed no change was required. They thought your understanding meant tolerance without limit. They didn't realize understanding has an edge. At some point, depth becomes discernment, and discernment becomes a boundary. You didn't wake up one day and suddenly decide to leave. You slowly realized that your capacity was being mistaken for obligation, that your ability to hold space was being used to justify someone else's refusal to step into it. And the moment that realization settled, everything began to shift. Quietly, Internally, irreversibly. Your absence spoke louder than every conversation. You didn't make a scene. You didn't deliver an ultimatum or announce your departure. You didn't raise your voice or lay out one final argument, hoping they would finally understand. You simply stopped chasing. You stopped initiating the emotional repairs. You stopped filling the gaps they left behind. You withdrew the emotional labor that had been holding the connection together. And that's when the avoidant finally felt it. For the first time, the silence wasn't softened, the distance wasn't explained away. The relationship no longer had someone constantly regulating the emotional climate. The weight they had avoided carrying, the responsibility of presence, of consistency, of showing up, landed squarely back on them. Avoidants are often calm when someone is pursuing them. The nervous system stays regulated when there is reassurance on tap. But the moment that reassurance disappears, the system reacts. Not because you were manipulative, but because the structure they depended on vanished. Your absence spoke louder than every conversation because it changed the environment. Words had always been something they could deflect, reinterpret, or delay. Absence couldn't be negotiated with. It couldn't be soothed with vague promises. It simply existed and forced awareness. They felt the loss of emotional access. They felt the absence of regulation. They felt the quiet panic of having to face themselves without a buffer. Power isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with threats or explanations. Power is what remains when you stop overfunctioning, when you no longer compensate for someone else's avoidance, when you let the relationship reflect true level of effort on both sides. You didn't take something from them. You stopped giving something you had been giving for free. And without that constant emotional supply, the dynamic collapsed into honesty. They were left with the reality of their own distance, the emptiness where connection had been maintained by your presence, the discomfort of realizing that the relationship hadn't been sustained by mutual commitment, but by your capacity. That's why their nervous system reacted, not because they suddenly understood your worth in an abstract way, but because they felt the destabilization of losing the person who had been holding everything together. Avoidants don't always miss the person first. They miss the regulation. And by the time they begin to sort through that panic, you're already gone. Not emotionally checked out in anger, but emotionally complete. You didn't disappear to be chased. You disappeared because you finally stopped chasing yourself away. They thought your depth was infinite. They thought your presence was guaranteed. They didn't realize your power lived in the moment you chose to step back. Because the truth is this, the moment you stopped chasing wasn't the moment you lost them. It was the moment you stopped losing yourself. And that's the kind of power no avoidant sees coming, because it doesn't look like force. It looks like finality. They weren't missing you. They were missing who they were with you. When you went quiet, something unfamiliar happened for them. Not dramatic, not explosive, just empty. Without your presence regulating the relationship, there was no one translating emotions, no one softening distance, no one absorbing the tension, so it wouldn't land on them. For the first time, they were alone with the patterns they had spent a lifetime avoiding. The withdrawal, the deflection, the half answers and emotional exits. Your silence didn't create these traits. It exposed them when you stopped filling the space. The space finally spoke, and what it revealed wasn't about missing you as a person in the way romantic stories like to frame it. They weren't longing for your voice or your body first. They were missing the version of themselves that existed when you were around. With you, they felt calmer without knowing why, more grounded without having earned it, more connected without having to stay present. You acted as an emotional regulator, steadying the system so they didn't have to develop that capacity themselves. When you left, that borrowed stability disappeared, and suddenly their inner world felt louder. Avoidants often believe they want freedom. What they actually want is relief from discomfort. Your presence had provided that relief. You managed the emotional weight of closeness so they could enjoy the benefits without confronting the cost. Without you, the emotional shortcuts vanished. And here's the part they never expected. Your silence wasn't manipulative. It wasn't a strategy to provoke longing or force realization. It was self-respect settling in. It was the natural consequence of someone who stopped explaining their worth to a person committed to misunderstanding it. You didn't disappear to be chased. You went quiet because you were done negotiating your humanity. Avoidants fear engulfment, but they fear self-confrontation more. Being close to you wasn't what terrified them. Being seen by themselves was your emotional presence, had acted like a mirror they could look away from. Once it was gone, there was nothing left to distract them from the truth of their own limitations. And in that silence, they felt the full weight of who they were without you, the unfinished self, the one who wanted connection but resisted responsibility, the one who longed for intimacy but fled consistency, the one who mistook distance for independence and control for safety. They didn't suddenly become self-aware overnight, but the absence of your emotional labor made their patterns louder, harder to ignore. And that discomfort, not longing, is what marked the beginning of regret. You weren't asking for too much, you were offering something rare. For a long time, they believed you were the source of pressure, that your needs were the reason they felt overwhelmed, that the relationship demanded too much of them. So they told themselves they needed space from you, space to breathe, to think, to feel like themselves again. What they didn't realize was that the pressure wasn't coming from you. It was coming from the part of them that refused to grow. You weren't asking for chaos or intensity. You weren't demanding perfection or constant reassurance. You were offering consistency, presence, emotional continuity, the kind of stability that doesn't control, it supports, the kind that doesn't trap, it anchors. Your emotional presence wasn't the problem. Their inability to stay present. You brought structure to the connection. You remembered details. You followed through. You showed up the same way in private and in conflict. And because avoidance often associates stability with loss of autonomy, they misread your reliability as confinement. They thought closeness meant limitation, not realizing that what felt constricting was their own underdeveloped capacity for intimacy. When you left, they finally experienced what instability actually feels like. Not drama, but absence. Not conflict, but the quiet lack of emotional grounding. The difference between space that heals and space that exposes. Without you, there was no steady rhythm, no emotional baseline, no one holding the thread of connection. When they dropped it, that's when the reframe happened. They realized too late that you were the stability, not the source of pressure, the source of balance. Not the one asking for too much, the one offering something rare, a secure emotional environment that could have supported growth if they had chosen it. But by the time that realization surfaced, you had already remembered your own value. You had already stepped out of the role of emotional stabilizer and back into yourself. You no longer needed them to recognize what they lost because you had finally named what you were giving. They may look back and understand you differently now. They may recognize that what you offered wasn't control, but safety. That what you asked for wasn't excess, but reciprocity. That the calm they felt with you wasn't accidental. It was created by your presence. But delayed insight doesn't rewind time. You weren't too much. You weren't demanding. You weren't the wrong partner. You were the right environment at the wrong moment for someone unwilling to evolve. And the hardest truth for them to sit with is this: you didn't become valuable when you left. You were always valuable. They simply didn't have the capacity to hold what you brought. By the time they recognized your stability, you no longer needed them to. You had already chosen a life where your steadiness wasn't mistaken for something disposable. And that's the kind of loss that doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles in quietly, long after you're gone. They expected understanding. They didn't expect finality. You didn't leave in anger. There was no explosion, no dramatic exit, no last attempt to be heard. You didn't storm out to make a point or threaten departure to force change. You left in clarity. And that distinction is what shattered the illusion they had been living inside. Avoidants are prepared for conflict. They know how to survive tension, deflect blame, and wait out emotional storms. Conflict feels familiar to them. It creates distance, and distance feels safe. They know how to manage someone's pain when that pain is expressed loudly. They know how to soothe, minimize, or temporarily appease distress. What they are not prepared for is quiet certainty. Your calm decision destabilized them more than any argument ever could. They expected understanding because understanding had always been your language. You had explained their behavior back to them gently, framed their distance compassionately, and held space for their fear without demanding immediate change. So they assumed that if things became uncomfortable again, you would do what you always did: pause, reflect, soften, and try once more. They didn't see finality coming. Because finality didn't look like anger, it looked like resolution. It looked like someone who had stopped negotiating their worth, someone who no longer needed to be chosen to feel whole, someone who realized that staying in a dynamic that required constant self-translation was costing more than leaving ever would. The moment you stopped negotiating your worth, the dynamic ended. Not because you took power from them, but because you reclaimed it for yourself. You didn't try to convince them of your value one last time. You didn't ask us reassurance or closure. You simply stepped out of a system that only functioned when you kept doubting yourself. That's why it felt sudden to them. Avoidants often believe control comes from distance. They assume that as long as they don't fully commit, they retain power. What they don't anticipate is the moment the other person decides they no longer want access to a relationship that requires emotional compromise to maintain. When you walked away without resentment, without chaos, without pleading, the leverage disappeared. They could manage your pain. They couldn't manage your resolve. Your clarity removed the emotional hooks that kept the dynamic alive. There was nothing left to argue with, nothing left to delay. The story ended not because you ran out of love, but because you ran out of self-betrayal. And that kind of ending is the one avoidants never see coming. If they wake up later, it doesn't mean you should wait. If awareness arrives for them later, after the loss, after the silence, after the reality sets in, it doesn't retroactively turn delay into destiny. Delayed awareness is still delayed. Growth that happens in the absence of the relationship does not obligate you to return to it. This is the part people struggle with most. When an avoidant finally recognizes what they lost, it can feel validating. It can feel like proof that you mattered. But recognition after the fact is not the same as readiness when it mattered. Love that arrives after loss is information, not an invitation. Their regret does not require your availability. You are not responsible for staying accessible in case someone evolves. You are not obligated to wait for someone to become capable of meeting you at the level you were already operating from. And you do not owe your future to someone's hindsight. Avoidants often grieve slowly, not because they didn't care, but because it takes distance for them to feel what proximity allowed them to avoid. That grief may surface months or years later when the safety of your presence is gone and the contrast becomes clear, but that timing belongs to them, not to you. You weren't powerful because you endured. Endurance alone is not strength. It's survival. You were powerful because you chose yourself without needing them to understand. You didn't wait for validation to leave. You didn't need them to agree with your decision. You trusted your internal clarity more than their external confusion. That is real power. Walking away didn't make you strong. It revealed the strength that was already there. The part of you that knew you could love deeply without disappearing, that knew staying in misalignment would cost you more than the pain of separation, that knew self-respect does not require consensus. If they regret losing you, that regret belongs to them. It is a reflection of what they were not ready to hold, not a signal that you should shrink your life to make room for their realization. You are allowed to move forward without carrying the weight of someone else's delayed growth. You didn't leave to teach them a lesson. You left because you learned one. And the lesson was simple but permanent. Love does not require you to stay where you are not met. Understanding does not obligate endurance. And closure does not come from being chosen late. It comes from choosing yourself on time. They may wake up one day and finally see your value clearly. But by then, you will have already built a life where your power is not proven by who regrets losing you, but by who gets to walk beside you because they were ready. And that is the ending they never anticipated, because it no longer includes them. They didn't lose you because they didn't care. They lost you because they couldn't show up. This is the truth that settles everything. They didn't lose you because they lacked feelings, depth, or attachment. They lost you because when presence was required, they couldn't offer it. When consistency mattered, they retreated. When the relationship asked for action instead of intention, they disappeared. Caring was never the issue. Capacity was. Understanding avoidant attachment explains behavior. It gives context to the distancing, the shutdowns, the fear of closeness. But explanation does not equal obligation. Insight does not require you to accommodate emotional absence. You can understand someone deeply and still choose not to stay where you are not met. You weren't asking for perfection. You weren't asking them to be healed. You were asking them to show up, to be present, to choose the relationship, not just in words, but in behavior. And when they couldn't, leaving wasn't abandonment. It was alignment. They had no idea you were this powerful because real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't argue, explain, or beg to be understood. Real power is quiet. It's the ability to walk away without needing validation, to let someone misunderstand you and still choose yourself. You didn't leave to punish them. You left because you stopped abandoning yourself. Walking away wasn't impulsive. It was the natural conclusion of patience meeting reality. You observed. You tried. You stayed regulated longer than most would. And when the truth became undeniable, that the connection required you to overfunction just to survive, you chose clarity over hope. Avoidants often expect doors to remain slightly open, access without responsibility, understanding without commitment. And choosing finality is what breaks the pattern. Not out of anger, but out of self-respect. They may one day realize what you offered. They may understand that your presence was stabilizing, that your consistency was rare, that your depth wasn't infinite. It was intentional. But delayed awareness doesn't rewrite the past, and it doesn't obligate your future. They didn't lose you because they didn't care. They lost you because they couldn't show up. And that truth is freeing because it means there was nothing more you needed to prove, fix, or sacrifice. Real power doesn't stay where it has to shrink. It leaves